You feel the shift before you see it. Not the brilliant burst of the sun, but a deepening quiet that precedes the light. It is that time when the deep ocean seems to draw a great, slow breath out across the water's edge, pulling back everything to a whisper. The cool air touches your exposed skin, carrying the mineral tang of wet salt and the deeper, cooler scent of the tide receding. You are already moving, not from alarm, but from a deeply established rhythm within your bones. Sleep has been dissolved by generations of work here, an internal clock tuned precisely to the lunar pull. You walk barefoot on ground that is still damp and cool beneath your soles, noticing how the tiny grains of crystallized salt crunch lightly, almost musically, with every step. These are not random crystals. They are the remnants of last night's high tide, settled thinly across the low-lying scrub and earth. The movement toward the pans is slow, deliberate. You navigate paths worn smooth by countless pairs of feet, a topographical memory etched into the very ground. The air feels heavier now, thick with mist that hasn't quite burned off yet. It clings to your hair and settles lightly on your shoulders, demanding only quiet movement. Ahead, stretching out in shallow curves across the landscape, are the massive solar evaporation pans. They do not look like man-made structures so much as an extension of the earth itself, a gentle concave basin that follows the natural contours of the coast. Already, even in the dim pre-dawn light, you can see the vast, milky surface where the water waits. It is a waiting, suspended moment, reflecting the soft, gray sky and the faint memory of the stars. You gather your tools. The woven basket feels familiar, its fibers seasoned by salt spray and sun-baked earth. You lift the wooden scoop. It is weighted just so in your hand, smooth from years of scooping crystalline mineral deposits. You examine the wood grain, noticing tiny streaks of pinkish ochre stain mixed with the brighter white residue, a record of every morning's labor. The rhythm takes over almost instantly. You join the line of other workers, each moving independently yet in collective synchronization. There are murmurs and soft coughs, sounds muffled by the heavy mist, punctuated only by the rhythmic shush of feet passing through damp salt residue. Each person moves with a deep economy of effort, knowing that wasted motion means lost time against the rising sun. As you draw closer to the edge of the deepest pan, slowing your steps, the faint smell of brine becomes more potent, a sharp, clean scent that speaks of minerals and tireless evaporation. You watch the way the tide line has settled, leaving behind intricate patterns in the mud flats and shallow pool edges. These patterns are nature's first lesson. Nothing is random here. You kneel near the edge, feeling the chill spray mist your forearms. The water at the very lip of the pan is remarkably placid, a mirror-like surface reflecting only the dull light overhead. You observe the residual sludge on the bottom, a complex mixture that has undergone countless cycles of concentration and depletion. It prompts a quiet thought about patience, an abstract concept made utterly physical by this job. The sea does not rush. It simply works, gradually pulling out what is contained within it, crystal by slow crystal. Your hands rest on the cool, damp earth for a moment, feeling the coolness transfer up your wrists. You are part of that patient process. The first streaks of actual dawn are just beginning to tint the eastern horizon, washing the mist in weak shades of lilac and pearly gray. This change in light alters everything. The wet salt surface seems to gather more light, intensifying its milky whiteness. The damp air seems to become slightly warmer, drawing your breath a little deeper. Your task begins with simple observation. You survey the perimeter of the pan. You are looking not just at water and mud, but at transitions. Where has the brine reached in the last few hours? Has the gentle current shifted against the seaward edge? The variations teach you more than any lecture ever could. They are read through the topography of dissolved minerals. You use your foot to gently probe a patch near the bank. The ground gives slightly underfoot, yielding a semi-solid paste, a perfect mix between liquid brine and soft, crystalline residue. This mixture is key. It shows that evaporation has occurred steadily, drawing out enough purity to be harvested. You shift your focus onto an area farther in, where the concentration seems highest. There, small mounds of dazzling white crystals have formed, catching the faintest light and glittering with cold permanence. You take up a shallow hand spade or a specialized wooden implement. The scoop moves through the residue with a soft scraping sound, gathering not just pure salt, but also mixed sediment, the inevitable byproduct that must be separated later. You notice how the crystal formations cluster. Some are hexagonal and sharp, suggesting rapid precipitation. Others are more rounded, settled gently by slower currents. Each shape tells you something about the day's conditions. The labor is not merely lifting material, it is interpreting geology in real time. This continuous dialogue with the mineral crust trains your senses to detect minute shifts in consistency, the change from a sticky gel to a dry powder. For example, you compare these observations mentally with the subtle changes in wind direction. A shift often signals which edges of the pan will see increased evaporation rate later in the day. You move along the bank, coordinating your actions with those beside you. There is no need for verbal command. The understanding is implicit, a shared labor history woven into muscle memory. You scoop a handful of the crystal crust and examine it close to your eye level. The salt smells utterly pure, mineral and sharp, completely unlike anything organic. This purity is what makes life possible here. The mist continues its gentle retreat, pulled back by the slow advance of the weak sun. As the light strengthens minimally, drying the surface dew from the leaves and rocks around you, your focus shifts from mere observation to initial collection. You begin carefully raking, brushing away the looser, most accessible layers of crystallization that have built up overnight. This early work is gentle because the raw material is still semi-soft, slightly tacky under your fingers. It requires a careful touch, lest you drag too much underlying muddy sediment into the pile. You are sorting by texture and visible purity, an intuitive judgment passed down through oral tradition. The salt must be handled as if it were fragile knowledge, valuable and easily lost. As the morning advances slightly, painting the sky with increasingly defined tones of pale blue and gold near the horizon line, you continue this quiet process of extraction. You manage to accumulate a good amount, filling your allotted baskets with the harvested white powder. The physical weight is noticeable but manageable, a testament to both the mineral's density and the enduring power of cooperative labor. The day's routine demands that this collection continues until the sun climbs high enough to drive off all remaining surface moisture. But for now, in this first cool stretch of hours, under the quiet pressure of the rising light, you are simply connecting with the source, the immense, patient energy of the Mediterranean Sea, a resource constantly renewing itself, while simultaneously demanding respect and constant effort from those who draw its bounty. The weak light of dawn is doing its work, softening the edges of the massive evaporation pans. You move toward the edge of the pool where the tide has barely left its mark, and you are learning to see not just salt, but patterns within the salt. The air here carries a particular smell, a mix of drying minerals, wet stone, and the sharp tang of distant seaweed. It is the scent of pure labor. You kneel by the shallowest edge, where the remaining brine has pulled back, leaving behind a delicate, crystalline film. You reach out slowly, brushing your fingers across the residue. The salt crystals feel different here than those you gathered at first light. They are finer, more uniform, and possess a pearly sheen that catches the weak illumination. This is the reading of the pans, and it requires absolute stillness. Your muscles remember the slow patience of the dawn. It is not enough to merely scoop what is visible. You must assess what lies beneath the surface tension, where the brine has been slowly concentrating over hours. Observing this concentration is a craft passed down through generations. Look how the light catches those tiny peaks and valleys in the crust. Each variation tells you something about the wind speed of the previous night or the depth of the water at the turn of the tide. The older workers move with an almost effortless slowness, their movements economical and deliberate. You observe them inspecting the pans near the edges where the pan structure meets the sand. They are not looking for bulk, they are looking for evidence. A patch that is too dry suggests a rapid shift in weather, while a particularly thick, undisturbed crust speaks to perfect, gentle evaporation. You pick up your wooden scoop again, but this time, your attention shifts from gathering material to observing the surface itself. You dip the scoop into a semi-solid section and lift it just enough so that the brine clings heavily to the wood. As you pull back, you watch how the water slowly drips, not in drops, but in thin, perfect streams, tracing lines of pure mineral content. The runoff is rich and clear, suggesting high purity. When your gaze rests on a particularly pristine patch, you notice how crystalline it appears against the darker, damp silt beneath. The contrast draws your focus entirely. You consider that this mineral deposit, which seems so simple, just hard white matter scraped from the earth's edge, is what connects your quiet cove to distant ports and wealthy markets hundreds of leagues away. It fuels life in cities you have only heard whispered about by traveling merchants. The process of reading the pans is an exercise in deep environmental awareness. You begin to predict, almost unconsciously, where the next good patch will be. A section that has remained slightly wetter despite the visible effort suggests a subterranean flow pattern, perhaps fed by a deeper spring or an underground current. These workers read the land like a book written in brine and crystal. You walk along the dry pathways between the vast pans. The sand under your feet is cool, carrying the grit of dried salt mixed with the more earthy composition of the local soil. You feel the subtle give and pull of the ground beneath your sandals. Occasionally, you pause to simply observe the rhythm of small life, a swift crab scuttling across the remaining crust, or the way a tiny wisp of sea smoke curls up from the wet mud. You stop next to a particularly large pan structure, built of stacked stone and reinforced wood. You run your hand lightly over the damp outer stones. They retain the cool breath of the night and the nearby ocean. The architecture itself is part of the process, designed for maximum exposure while minimizing labor. It guides the water flow with patient geometry. As you continue your inspection, you begin to categorize the different types of deposits. There are rough, irregularly shaped clusters where rapid drying occurred. These require careful sorting later. Then there are the sheets, smooth and vast, indicating gradual, consistent evaporation favored by steady winds. And finally, the fine residue, the powder that coats everything in a uniform layer, suggesting months of subtle mineral buildup. When you select a patch to collect from, your movements become smoother, less hesitant than they were earlier. You are no longer just collecting, you are verifying the quality through touch and sight. You scrape gently, ensuring you lift only what is needed without disturbing the underlying structure that dictates future collection points. This precision of action speaks volumes about the value placed on every single crystal. The slow movement teaches a profound patience. You learn to appreciate the immense time scale involved in simple crystallization. The salt was not deposited overnight. It was pulled from the deepest parts of the sea and concentrated over countless cycles, tended by the sun and the moon's gravitational pull. This continuous rhythm is inescapable here. Meanwhile, your neighbors continue their quiet, dedicated work around you. There are no shouts or hurried calls, only the soft, scraping sound of wood against crust, a rhythmic sigh that blends into the background hum of early commerce. You notice how this communal silence is itself a form of communication, a shared understanding of the demanding routine and the inherent respect for the resource. The task feels meditative. Your senses become hyper-aware. The minute coolness lingering in your fingertips, the faint, mineral dust that settles on your exposed skin, smelling faintly of brine, the predictable, comforting sound of the waves drawing back even when you are far from the true waterline. You spend a longer moment observing the interplay between light and crystal. As the weak sun strengthens its presence, it hits the angled surfaces of the salt pans just right, causing the crystals to gleam with an unexpected internal luminescence. This visual richness reminds you that even this humble mineral has a surprising depth of character, transforming ordinary labor into a kind of alchemy. The reading of the pans is ultimately about understanding balance, the necessary interplay between high tide and low tide, intense sun and gentle wind, available energy and careful effort. It is a quiet, constant dialogue with nature that keeps your community both anchored and prosperous. You absorb this lesson not as theory, but as physical rhythm, knowing that tomorrow you will return to interpret the pans again, learning more from the silent wisdom of the sea. You walk toward the salt pans again, your feet already dusted with a fine, crystalline white powder. This grit feels oddly natural now, like the dust of an old, familiar home. The sun has climbed higher than it was when you awoke, softening the edges of the morning light into a milky haze across the vast evaporation beds. There is a low rhythm to the sound accompanying your walk, the faint slosh of water against packed earth, and the steady whisper of other workers moving with practiced, unhurried grace. You move through the channels that separate the drying areas, each one bearing the subtle story of yesterday's evaporated tides. Ahead, the salt crust catches the diffuse light, gleaming faintly like scattered bone shards. It is a dazzling white surface contrasted by the dark, damp earth surrounding it. You stop near the edge of one large pan. The remaining brine pools are not deep. Rather, they have settled into a thin, highly viscous sheen across the bottom. You crouch slightly, bringing your gaze close to the surface tension. Reading these pans is an art that requires patience and careful attention. You look past the immediate crystals to assess the deeper residue, the mineral density beneath the surface film. A good patch will show signs of uniform, slow crystallization. Areas with muddy patches or rapidly varying colors signal inconsistent evaporation, a less desirable harvest. This knowledge, passed down from elders whose names you barely remember, is written into your muscles and eyes. The first task involves gathering the visible, stable crystals, the flakes that have lifted themselves out of the residual brine. You select your wooden scoop, its shallow bowl smooth from countless dips. There is no urgency to this motion. Your movements are economical, designed to lift only what is ready. The wet salt feels cool and slick in the scoop's basin. As you lift it, tiny, sparkling flakes cling to the edges of the wood, catching the light like miniature captured stars. This material, freshly lifted from the brine bed, must be handled with care. It retains a slight moisture, making it heavy and unstable if moved carelessly. The crystals are gathered not into one place, but into designated mats, large woven reed sheets laid out specifically for this purpose. You walk toward the nearest mat. It already holds a scattering of earlier scoops, forming low drifts of white material. This initial spread is merely a temporary holding area, a staging ground before the final purification process begins later in the day. The sheer volume of salt required to sustain the community is immense. It moves slowly across these woven surfaces, accumulating steadily. Next, you adopt the spreading rhythm. You use your free hand, or sometimes a flat piece of salvaged wood, a gentle spreader, to lightly push and redistribute the gathered crystals on the mat. This action is counterintuitive, yet essential. By spreading the wet material thinly and evenly, you maximize exposure to the slightly warmer air and the sun's growing energy. You are encouraging the remaining trace moisture to evaporate fully, promoting consistent structure and purity throughout the deposit. It feels like an exercise in gentle topography, lifting and pushing the salt until it settles into a level, smooth expanse. The fine powder seems to sigh faintly as it moves under your fingertips. You find yourself falling into a meditative state within this repetitive motion. The task is physical, requiring consistent low-level strength, bending at the knees, steadying the scoop, and pushing with controlled pressure. Your breathing slows almost imperceptibly, syncing itself not to effort, but to the rhythm of the spread. It is a quiet conversation between your body and the mineral deposits. You are paying close attention to how the crystals respond to the friction of the spreader. They don't crumble easily. They maintain a structural integrity that speaks to their careful, long process of formation over time. Looking outward from the mat, you notice details you might otherwise overlook. A family of small coastal birds dips and dives into the lingering brine puddles, undisturbed by your steady work. Their movements are quick bursts of energy against the slow, monumental pace of your labor. The architecture surrounding the pans is simple, low mud brick retaining walls and rough plank walkways that bear the cumulative wear of generations of workers before you. These walls define not just the fields, but the very rhythm of life here, a cycle governed by evaporation and celestial timing. The collective effort of the community becomes apparent in how smoothly everyone works. There is no shouting or urgent direction. Knowledge moves through shared glances and synchronized actions. You see an older worker approaching a section you are clearing. She nods to you, indicating that her spot needs your careful scoop. The exchange requires nothing more than mutual acknowledgement, a tacit agreement on the rhythm of labor. You smoothly move your equipment over, understanding that the success of this day's harvest relies not just on individual strength, but on collective timing. The work is steady, almost hypnotizing in its predictability. Each scoop brings a small amount of salt, each spread encourages perfection. As you continue moving along the mat, you begin to consider the fundamental nature of this product. This white mineral, lifted from the endless embrace of the sea, shrinks the vast ocean down into manageable, crystalline piles. It is an alchemy performed by sun and gravity, harnessed through human discipline. You reflect on how such a simple resource became a linchpin for Phoenician trade, connecting your small coastal outpost to far inland markets that required salt for preservation and diet. Sometimes, pausing with the scoop held midair, you simply look at your hands coated in white grit. The texture is gritty but fine. The cool dampness remains even under the increasing warmth of the sun. This constant contact grounds you. You are connected to the earth here, standing between the sea and the arid inland air. There is a profound sense of place that comes from mastering such an elemental process. It speaks less to grand conquests than to necessary survival, the quiet, enduring rhythm of a community built upon salt. The sun climbs higher now, and the labor continues, transforming small puddles into vast beds of glistening white. Your task remains unchanged. Scoop carefully, spread evenly, encourage perfection, waiting for the day's yield to settle under the watchful eye of the relentless, beautiful cycle. The piles of damp salt collected from the pans feel heavy under your palms. They are not uniformly white. Some mounds have a reddish tint, perhaps from traces of earth near the edges, while others retain the greenish hue of algal deposits that grew in the slower-moving brine. You move towards the designated clearing, a space reserved for refinement. Here, the labor changes its rhythm completely. Where before you were scooping and spreading wet material, now your task is one of careful breaking and sorting. You kneel on the ground, the coolness seeping up through the cloth wrapped around your knees. Before you sits a low, sturdy stone structure, the grindstone's cousin, perhaps just specialized hardwood tools designed to fracture the more stubborn crystals. You begin with the larger lumps that have resisted drying into perfect white flakes. These lumps are often impure. They contain layers of earth minerals or solidified remnants of seaweed mixed within the crystalline structure. Your initial motion is slow. You select a lump, tracing its rough edges with your fingers. The salt has a characteristic granular sharpness when dry, but these pieces retain a slightly damp integrity. As you use the tool, it might be a rounded stone pestle or just the flat side of a hardwood paddle. You do not strike sharply. Instead, you apply steady lateral pressure, working against the inherent resistance of the mineral structure. This requires patience and an understanding of how different crystalline forms break apart. The dust that rises is incredibly fine, catching the weak mid-morning sunlight filtering through the shed's lattice roof. You inhale slowly. The smell is pure, clean salt, mingled with a fainter, slightly metallic scent, the breath of the deep sea trapped within the crystals. This subtle difference in aroma tells you something about the mineral's origin and its purity. As you work, your eyes become highly attuned to texture. Some salts flake away in large, ragged pieces, suggesting they were quickly formed or caught adhering to an object. Other sections crumble with a delicate, almost flour-like dust, indicating slower, more layered deposition over time. You mentally categorize these finds, the brittle versus the composite. This sorting process is not just about cleanliness. It is an act of recognizing quality. The purest salt, the one most sought after by the inland merchants, must be dazzling white and free from vegetal or earthy staining. It tells a story of steady, clean evaporation under clear skies. You gather these broken flakes into woven trays placed before you, creating small, perfect piles of potential wealth. Sometimes, an assistant will pass by, carrying a handful of material, pausing briefly beside your station to observe the precision of your movements. They do not speak, they simply watch, and their gaze is one of shared understanding, the silent respect given to deep knowledge. Some large sections are left untouched until later in the day. These blocks of crystallized salt require a different technique. You might use cupped hands or specialized smooth river stones to gently break off the outer layers, peeling away the impurities that cling like rough crusts. This action demands strength tempered by tenderness. If you apply too much force, you shatter valuable inner structure. If you are too gentle, you leave the contamination intact. The process of refinement seems to slow time itself. Every small piece you break free, every flake you sort into a clean pile, becomes an extension of your own patience. You find yourself counting not the flakes, but the breaths between them. It is a meditative rhythm. The constant gentle clack or shush of stone against salt provides a steady accompaniment, a sonic backdrop to the meticulous work. This repetition allows your mind to drift away from the day's physical demands and settle into the pure focus of the mineral itself. You are not merely processing raw material. You are performing an act of chemical separation, guided by generations of accumulated observational skill. When you finally reach a section that has been drying for perhaps 2 or 3 days, the crust is thicker, more cohesive, resembling delicate white armor protecting the salt within. Here, grinding with sheer force is useless. Instead, you must allow water, a slight amount introduced from your cup to soften the adhesion points, making the material pliant enough to separate along natural crystalline cleavage lines. The resulting product is a surprisingly uniform flake, smooth to the touch, yet possessing a satisfying weight. You admire this perfect piece, recognizing the balance between the elemental power of the sea and the practiced skill of your hands. It feels cool in your palm, a direct link back to the evaporated tide cycles that formed it. As the work continues, you begin to observe how the purity affects the appearance of the salt when stacked. The clean flakes stack with sharp angles and bright whiteness. The impure mix tends to slump, its colors bleeding together into duller shades. This visual grammar is what speaks volumes in the market, the proof of a good harvest. There is a subtle understanding here that this quiet labor has an immense value. It sustains beyond simple consumption. The salt will be ground for other purposes, mixing with fats to preserve meats, or dissolved into poultices that soothe superficial scrapes and minor cuts. Your hands are working not just commodities, but necessities of life itself. You gather your sorted piles, the best flakes from the initial breakdown, the more uniform sheets from the softer sections, and perhaps a small pile reserved for further testing. You sweep them carefully into larger baskets, watching how each movement maintains the desired air of purity. The dust motes dancing in the shafts of light seem to highlight the miraculous transformation. Vast amounts of water and sun's energy, distilled down to this white, essential powder. It is a silent testament to the power of natural cycles, refined by human attention. The bright heat of the midday sun has climbed overhead, beating down upon the expansive fields where the salt crusts lie. The light is intensely white, almost blinding when you look directly at the wet expanse, and it carries with it a palpable warmth that rises from the earth and the evaporating brine pools. You finally pause your movement, allowing your muscles to settle into the slower cadence of rest. Around you, the rhythm of labor has slowed into a murmur of quiet activity. The air here feels thick, weighted by humidity and the mineral scent of concentrated sea life, a sharp tang mixed with the sweeter, deeper smell of drying earth. You find a patch of shade cast by a low embankment wall, a necessary reprieve from the solar intensity. You settle down onto a woven mat that has absorbed years of salt dust, the fibers rough beneath your back. The group finds its own way into this stillness, the workers gathering near the central collection point. There is no urgent need to speak. The shared exhaustion creates a quiet understanding far more potent than any shouted conversation could be. Some sit with their hands resting on their knees, eyes half closed, looking out toward the slow creep of the tide line that still defines the edge of your workspace. You feel the fine layer of salt dust coating the skin on your exposed arms and face, a subtle reminder of where you are and what sustains this community's necessary commerce. The time for deep work pauses here, giving way to the pause for sustenance. A handful of dried dates are passed around, dark and sticky against your fingertips. Someone slowly peels flatbread from a stack woven nearby. The bread smells faintly of roasted grain and smoke, completely different from the sharp mineral scent surrounding you, grounding you in something sweet and immediate. You accept the pieces. They are not just food, but a necessary punctuation mark in the long cycle of labor. Sharing this simple meal requires no ceremony, only the mutual acknowledgement that even routine tasks demand nourishment. You take a slow bite of the soft bread, noticing how the dryness on your tongue immediately finds some temporary relief. Across the small circle of workers, people watch their hands as they break apart the dates, savoring the juice and the slight chewiness. There is an economy to these moments, for nothing truly random happens. Even rest feels structured by the demands of tomorrow's work. An older worker near you shifts slightly, her back protesting with a soft creak. You watch the movement and realize that every joint and every muscle here carries the weight of many seasons spent under this same unforgiving sun. Their knowledge is visible in the way they move, economical and practiced. As the initial need for fuel passes, the exchange begins subtly, through gestures more than words. A younger worker points not to a specific crystal patch, but toward the sky, the slow drift of few clouds, the slight shift in the angle of the midday sun. This is how knowledge travels here, not by reciting formulas, but by observing patterns and making quiet connections between adjacent people. You notice two men sitting slightly apart from the main group, near a patch where the crystallized salt has formed thick, unnatural formations against the retaining wall. They are speaking in low tones, their conversation pitched just below the level of the gentle lapping water. You cannot catch every word, but you absorb the quality of the exchange. It is measured and respectful. They seem to be talking about efficiency, perhaps about the changing weather patterns that will affect tomorrow's harvest, or maybe comparing the yield from the pans worked last week versus the abundance seen today. The way they speak reminds you that this salt does more than just exist on the beach. It is a constant conversational element in your lives. It dictates who needs to move where, which techniques need refinement, and how much effort must be budgeted for the coming days. The discussions are technical, yet deeply ingrained with local wisdom, the understanding of how the tide breathes against the salt flats. Your gaze drifts back to the pans themselves, now seen through a slightly rested mind. You observe the patterns again, but this time your observation is less about immediate extraction and more about holistic assessment. The variations in crystalline size are not just material differences. They hold narratives of evaporation speed. Where the salt forms thick, almost muddy crusts, it tells a story of minimal wave action, a predictable calm that allowed for slow concentration. Conversely, where the salt has been washed into finer drifts near the drainage channels, it speaks of faster, more agitated tides, yielding smaller, but perhaps purer, flakes. This silent conversation among the environment and the workers is profound. It reinforces a philosophy that labor here is not merely physical effort. It is an ongoing process of reading natural science, geology, meteorology, and fluid dynamics, with bare hands and quiet intuition. You realize that generations have accumulated this specialized understanding, transmitting it not through written law, but through lived presence and repeated observation. You rise slowly from your mat as the period of deep rest wanes, gently stretching your hamstrings to feel the familiar pull in your hips and knees. The desire to simply sit remains strong, an easy call back to repose, but the mineral smell and the bright intensity of the sun pull you back toward engagement. You begin to walk again, not with the vigorous pace of morning harvesting, but with a measured, contemplative stroll that allows your eyes to adjust fully to the blinding whiteness of the drying beds. As you traverse the perimeter of the pans, you pass by smaller piles already gathered, the product of hours' work. You observe how these rough mounds contrast sharply with the raw, white brilliance of the still wet crusts nearby. Each pile represents accumulated effort, sweat mixed with brine, skilled hands moving slowly through the crystalline deposits. It is a testament to steady accumulation, day after measured day. A gentle warmth spreads across your chest, a calming sense of belonging that comes from this shared commitment to the mineral. You think about how everything, the simple flatbread, the careful murmurs of knowledge exchange, even the rhythm of your own breath against the background sound of slow, distant waves, is dependent on this endless white commodity. This salt was once just ocean water. Through the labor of human hands and the patience of nature, it has been refined into something vital enough to bridge continents and sustain far inland settlements that rely completely upon your coastal rhythm. The work continues around you, picking up its steady pace. The midday rest was necessary not only for physical recovery, but also for a collective recalibration of thought. You approach the main staging area, ready to resume the refined labor of spreading and gathering, carrying with you the quiet understanding that the finest product requires not just effort, but observation, patience, and the simple grace of knowing when and how to pause. You lift the basket, its woven reeds smelling faintly of dried brine and earth. It is an empty weight, which feels strangely heavier than anything else you have carried all day. You walk away from the deep pans where the final crystals were gathered, moving toward a designated sorting area. This space is less about nature's cycle and more about human organization. It is here that natural abundance must submit to the order of exchange. The first task is not merely stacking, but assessing. You begin by picking up a small pile of salt near your feet. It catches the weak slant of afternoon sun, flashing brilliant white against the dusty earth. But you know that salt is a word far too large for this simple substance. To the passing merchant, it is simply currency. To you, it is a complex mineral, refined by the slow, patient breath of the sea. You examine the pile carefully. Some pieces are rough and jagged, having been scooped directly from the pan floor where they rested against damp clay or root matter. These are weighty, but their purity is doubtful. They must be separated first, creating a category in your mind for mixed crude. Next, you handle flatter, more uniform flakes, the desirable product. You observe how these have crystallized slowly, perhaps catching the perfect touch of dry wind over many hours, achieving that delicate paleness. As you sort, you instinctively feel the texture difference. The jagged pieces crumble with a hard, brittle crunch under your fingertips, suggesting pockets of trapped moisture and impurities. The flatter flakes, however, feel lighter, almost like solidified dust. They possess an ethereal dryness. This subtle feeling in your hands dictates their value. You reach for a small wooden tray designed specifically for grading. Placing the mixed crudes into one corner of the tray, you shift the perfect flakes to another. You are not just sorting by size, but by potential journey. A merchant needs reliable measure, and therefore consistency in appearance. The movement becomes rhythmic: pick up, evaluate, place down. The steady scraping sound of your fingers against the rough wood surface fills a pocket of quiet. You watch the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light entering from the open side of the shed. Each mote seems to carry a piece of time. The time spent evaporating under the fierce sun, the time spent forming over seasons, and now, the time required for your judgment. The value of this mineral is not inherent simply because it exists by the sea. Its worth is entirely derived from how well you can prove its purity. You think about the inland villages, the settlements nestled far back from the ocean's immediate reach. They rely on salt for preserving everything: meat, fish, and even certain foodstuffs that require curing. Their diet depends upon the guarantee of this white commodity. Sometimes, your mind drifts to how essential this basic element is to life itself. You remember observing last week how the elders would mix a strong brine wash onto small cuts or scrapes, believing its simple power could draw out sickness. It was always more than trade. It was survival magic, grounded in chemistry. You scoop a handful of the finest-looking flakes, degrade a material, and place them carefully into a container marked for measurement. The act feels almost ceremonial. You treat this small pile as if it were a highly polished jewel. Its whiteness seems deeper here than it did when emerging from the mud and sun. Next, you move toward the measuring area, where specialized weights are kept. These bronze or copper scales have been calibrated over generations of trade. They speak silently of law and established practice. You pour your chosen pile into the basin of the scale. The first lift is always unsettling, a momentary uncertainty about whether the pile truly represents its stated quality. The scale mechanism requires a specific attention. You cup your hands, steadying your breathing as you wait for the delicate balance to settle. This waiting period teaches more than any physical labor. It demands stillness and profound confidence in one's own accumulated knowledge. You are performing a calculation with mineral grains, an estimation of bulk quality translated into commercial weight. You repeat this process several times, adjusting your selection, sometimes adding a bit more from the grade B category to stabilize the total measure, knowing that merchants understand and accept slight variations if the overall composition is excellent. You are teaching yourself and subtly educating anyone watching that trade requires not only abundance but predictability. The weights feel cool against your palms, bearing down on you in a steady rhythm of gravity and trade necessity. When the balance finally settles at the designated marked point, there is a quiet satisfaction, a professional kind of closure. You have successfully quantified the labor of the past hours, the patience under the sun, the meticulous scooping from the pans. Looking out towards the expanse of the sea beyond the storage sheds, you notice how the deep blue water meets the paler gray horizon. The endless rhythm of the tide continues, utterly indifferent to the calculations being made in your sheltered yard. Yet, it is this indifference that provides the reliable resource. You feel a kinship with the ocean's sheer constancy. It simply gives. Your community has learned the discipline of accepting that bounty and refining its value. The physical act of counting and weighing becomes deeply meditative. You are translating raw geological material into portable economic power. This realization grounds you further in the social fabric of Phoenicia. Life is a cycle, and trade is the necessary mechanism that keeps that cycle turning smoothly between the tides, the drying mats, and the demanding needs of distant inland populations. The sun continues its slow descent, painting the white piles with long, golden streaks, awaiting the weight and definition of their worth. After the steady rhythm of weighing and sorting by the scale, your attention drifts away from the purity grades. You watch a handful of fine, pale crystals fall through your fingers, realizing that their value is not only measured in weight or grade, but also in the simple things they help sustain. The sun has climbed higher now, its heat becoming more insistent upon the exposed pans. The air feels thick with the mineral tang of evaporated sea life and salt. You notice movement around you, a subtle shift that catches your eye. An elderly woman kneeling near a low basin by the edge of the compound. She is not working on the pans, but rather attending to something delicate and wet. The basin holds water mixed with small amounts of coarse salt crystals, a simple brine wash. You watch her hands, calloused and steady, as she gently dips a piece of woven linen into the solution. Her movements are economical, imbued with a familiarity that suggests deep habit, not merely necessity. She is tending to skin, perhaps a minor burn or a scrape sustained from other tasks. You observe how the water slightly changes when mixed with the salt, becoming noticeably cooler and taking on a clean, sharp smell that cuts through the heavy scent of the day's work. This small domestic ritual, set against the backdrop of the massive commercial endeavor of the drying beds, draws your focus entirely. The woman applies the cool wash to the wound, murmuring softly, perhaps an old chant or a simple formula for healing. It is not the grand spectacle of a voyage nor the exchange in the market square. It is this quiet, intimate moment of care that holds a kind of profound stillness. As you observe the interaction between the saline water and the skin, you realize that salt's function here transcends pure commerce. It is a medicine, a vital component used to draw out sickness or cleanse the deepest irritations. The historical significance shifts gently from what your product is for trade to what it can quietly do for life itself. The other workers are still moving about them. Some continue refining crystal piles, others scoop residual moisture, but their movements slow down almost imperceptibly as they too take note of this scene. There is a shared understanding amongst the seasoned community members. Salt is more than just currency. It is nourishment, protection, and cure. You begin to consider how essential this simple mineral truly is. Before you can think of its role in flavoring food or preserving meats for the journey inland, there is the foundational necessity of cleaning wounds and balancing the body's internal chemistry through cleansing washes. The sea does not merely provide a source of bulk goods, it offers biological support. Your mind gently wanders back to the raw material, the wet, glittering piles of crystalline salt waiting in various stages of drying. You see how different preparations yield different properties. Some washed and dried for the market scale, others kept in more immediate, less refined containers for daily household use, reserved specifically for its cleansing power. The smell of the brine wash becomes a persistent sensory detail, a clean, mineral scent that is profoundly unlike the deep, iodine tang of the ocean itself. It feels grounded, manageable, contained for specific purposes. You remember the small piles of medicinal salt kept separate from the great trade stores. They are set aside differently. They hold an intangible value beyond their weight. This separation in your mind is illuminating. The same crystalline structure that allows a Phoenician merchant to negotiate favorable terms with inland tribes is also what allows a child's scrape to heal cleanly and swiftly. It suggests a depth of utility rarely contemplated when one only sees the scale of the enterprise. Salt manages borders, yes, but it also manages biology. The quiet observation brings you into a deep rhythmic pace. You slow your breathing, matching it to the gentle splash of the rinse water hitting the stone basin. This measured tempo allows the sensory input, the cool touch of wet linen, the sharp smell, the steady rhythm of washing, to fill your awareness completely. You think about the local diet, too. The simple salt used in cooking is not just for flavor. It enhances the body's ability to absorb nutrients from basic grains and dates. It makes the sustenance available, making the meager meal feel complete and sustaining. This deep knowledge of mineral synergy is woven into the fabric of life here by the water. Sometimes, you might notice a small pile of salt reserved for pickling or curing fish parts, held separately from both the trading grade and the wound wash. Even in its preparatory state, this distinct grouping suggests a specific ritual use, a quiet acknowledgement that different needs require different grades, even if they come from the same vast pan. The sun continues to climb, bathing the pans in a bright, relentless light that intensifies every crystal's sparkle. Yet, within the rhythm of your labor, there is now an added layer of understanding. You are not just a salt harvester. You are custodian of mineral sustenance, knowing how this white dust influences healing and endurance. As the immediate sensory focus returns to your own tasks, sorting and stacking, the knowledge gained from this observation settles into the quiet background hum of your day. The memory of that cool wash, the faint scent rising off the linen, remains a gentle undercurrent. You move with slightly more awareness now, recognizing the subtle but profound cycle. Harvest for trade in the morning, cleansing and healing for life itself at midday, until finally, the slow retreat to securing the yield as evening approaches. This twin purpose grounds your labor in a much deeper rhythm than mere economics would suggest. The intense heat of the midday sun begins to lift, softening into a gentler wash of late afternoon light. You carry a woven basket, its weight familiar on your hip, moving away from the bright, open expanse of the pans and towards the quiet enclosure of the storage shed. The walk is slow, measured by the increasing shadows cast by the low buildings surrounding you. Inside, the air cools immediately, carrying a different smell than the sharp tang of brine. It is the dry, mineral scent of countless generations of stored salt, a cool, clean dustiness that seems to settle deep into your lungs. You are gathering the day's yield, the precious harvest that must be secured and protected from both the rain and the creeping moistness of the coastal earth. You reach a designated section within the shed. Before you lie already stacked piles, mounds built by your hands and the hands of countless others before you. These are not simply bags of crystals. They are a geography of mineral wealth, each layer telling a quiet story of the tides that brought them to life. The salt on your fingers is cool and slightly abrasive, remaining white even after hours under the tropical sun. The initial task is systematic cooling. The large piles absorb the day's heat and must now be stabilized before they can be stacked too high or covered. You work near a freshly completed section. Your movements are careful, economical. First, you gently rake over the uppermost surface layer of crystals with a specialized wooden rake. It is not a vigorous scrubbing motion, but rather a brushing, lifting off any loose dust or small foreign objects that might have adhered during transport from the field. You observe how the light catches the edges of these large, geometric crystals. Some are irregular shards, others look like perfectly formed cubes, testament to different stages of crystallization in varying brine concentrations. As you brush away the surface grime, you notice the subtle imperfections in the stacks already here. Some corners have sagged slightly. A small amount of moisture has wicked up from the packed earth floor and compromised the structural integrity. You gently push at these sagging areas with the rake, steadying the edges, rebalancing them into neat, cohesive piles. This is not just physical labor. It is an act of preservation, ensuring that future laborers find the salt in its best possible state. The history of this process rests upon meticulous observation. If a pile settles too much, it risks becoming damp and losing its marketable purity. You run your fingers over the face of a stack, feeling for any telltale slickness or uneven damp patch. The sensation is crucial. The difference between dry, chalky grit and slightly tacky crystals is immediately apparent to your touch. After stabilizing the foundation stacks, you begin the work of layering and stacking the day's newly collected salt. You do not simply dump, you construct. You aim for a careful pyramidal structure, ensuring that each layer supports the one above it without creating unnecessary internal pressures that could lead to collapse or uneven compaction. The fresh piles are deposited gently onto the existing base, filling in gaps and raising the overall volume of the stored goods. As you work, your attention is drawn to how these vast quantities of salt transform the space within the shed. Where previously there was only damp earth and shadowed beams, now stands a glowing landscape of brilliant white mineral. The contrast between the stark, cool white of the salt and the deeper shadows cast by the drying racks is surprisingly dramatic. It feels like you are working in an enormous underground cavern filled with captured sunlight. The sheer weight of this accumulation becomes apparent. You calculate mentally, based on past weeks' harvests, the estimated tonnage stored here. This amount represents not just crystallized water, but stability for your community. When trade caravans from the distant inland settlements arrive, they will come for these mounds. They will haggle over grade and quantity, their fortunes momentarily tied to this pile of crystalline bounty. You move to the final stage, covering. You select large sheets of woven mats or thick hides, materials chosen specifically for their ability to breathe while still acting as a reliable barrier against excess moisture, dust, and insects. Laying these covers requires careful positioning. The mat must be draped over the entire structure, accommodating the uneven contours of the salt piles without creating air pockets that could encourage mold growth. You work methodically, drawing the edges of the protective covering tautly around the largest mounds. As you finish draping one section and smoothing out the cloth, you take a moment to breathe deeply. The dustiness now seems less aggressive, more like a comforting memory on your clothes and skin. It is the weight of necessity that settles over you, this understanding that every day's labor culminates in this silent act of preservation. The silence inside the deep storage sheds is profound, broken only by the soft scrape of wood against mineral and your own quiet movements. In this enclosure, the rush of the maritime world seems distant. All that matters is the perfect stacking, the complete coverage, and the enduring purity of what you have brought in from the sun-drenched pans. You pause, resting your hands on a cool pile. You think about the salt itself. It did not come solely from the sea. It was worked by the sun's steady evaporation, caught by the earth, purified by endless cycles of brine and air. This deep storage does more than just hold crystals. It holds the history of resourcefulness, passed down through generations who understood that scarcity demands diligence. Your hands are coated in a fine layer of residue, a unique blend of salt, dust, and the oils from your skin. You wipe them clean on a piece of coarse cloth, but you know this faint mineral scent will linger beneath your fingernails until the next tide rises. The work is done for the day, and as you exit the cool, echoing sheds back into the deepening twilight, the weight of the secured harvest feels less like a burden and more like quiet assurance. A deep, steady breath taken by the entire community before they rest. The sun is beginning its slow climb toward the open water, but you do not feel the heat yet. A gentle coolness clings to your skin as you walk away from the clustered activity of the salt sheds. The dust motes kicked up by the day's labor seem suspended in the still air, catching the first weak, pearlescent light. You follow the path that leads down toward the edge of the bay, a gradual descent where the ground shifts from packed earth to loose, coarse sand. Your sandals make a soft, rhythmic sound against the mixed surface, a steady padding that measures your steps away from the industry and into quiet thought. You pause at the true water's edge. The air here changes immediately. It grows cooler, carrying a distinct, bracing scent of wet kelp and deep ocean salt. This is the breath of the Mediterranean itself, ancient and unchanging. You watch the waves arriving, not with dramatic crash, but with that long, whispering sigh as they finally retreat. It is this receding edge you notice, the meticulous line where the water gives up its weight to gravity, leaving behind a temporary sheen on the dark stones. You feel your feet tracing the wet margin left by the last pull of the tide. The sand underfoot is cool, almost chilled through the leather soles of your sandals, and it holds the lingering dampness that hints at depths unseen. This contrast, the dryness of the dusty path versus the cold certainty of the receding water, is a constant rhythm in your life. You look out across the vast expanse where the sky seems to meet the sea without any defined line, only a merging of light and infinite blue. The sense of time here is different from time inside the pans. In the sheds, time was measured by scoops, by crust thickness, by the sun's brutal efficiency. Here, time stretches out in a slow, liquid expanse. You turn your head slightly to observe the movement far out at sea. A small fishing boat moves steadily, cutting a clean wake through the water. Its journey seems both minor and eternal. It reminds you that the sea does not care about the quality of your salt, nor the weight of your harvest. It simply exists. Walking slowly now, you begin to look closer at the physical interface between land and sea. You notice small patches of bleached shell, the smooth, white remnants of lives long past. They are scattered randomly across the beach stones, each one telling a silent story of currents and erosion. You pick up a piece. It is curved slightly, surprisingly light in your palm. It has survived countless cycles of water swelling around it and pulling it back again. These shells bring to mind the salt crystals you worked with all day. Each tiny flake and lump, which was pulled from the sea's edge, had passed through a purification process, the slow alchemy of evaporation. You consider that every piece of white crystal beneath your fingers is itself a monument to patience, requiring only vast amounts of quiet time and relentless natural force to become visible in such abundance. This realization settles gently over you. The salt was never just a commodity. It was an accumulator of endurance. The sea had provided the water, but the sun and the wind, acting together over millennia, had achieved the concentration. You understand now that the immense value they traded wasn't just in the mineral itself, but in the successful mastery of time, the ability to wait for the tide, the perfect moment of evaporation, the proper cooling cycle. You walk further until you reach a low ridge of darker, firmer earth where the beach slopes sharply down. Here, the air holds a sharper salinity, and you notice small groups of gulls circling overhead. They cry out with sharp, bright calls that echo momentarily off the nearby buildings. You stop for a moment, simply absorbing the sounds, the rhythmic lap against the rocks further down, the distant chatter of people beginning to wake in the village, the keen calling of the gulls. The sea's expanse gives you room to think about cycles, the way life continuously returns to a fixed pattern. Today, you woke with the promise of the moon's tide. You worked under the sun's relentless gaze. And now, as the work concludes, you stand here at the threshold between water and earth, observing the steady rhythm of the ebb and flow. The cycle is visible in everything. How the tides pull back to expose wet sand only to be covered again by tomorrow's swell. It is reflected in your community's life, the disciplined waking before dawn, the methodical labor through midday heat, and the final packing away of materials as the evening shadows lengthen. You consider the sheer scale of the Mediterranean. When you look out across its breadth, it feels immense, overwhelming even, yet at this same time, it provides everything. The water for life, the wind for movement, and the raw mineral material necessary to sustain both your civilization and the distant settlements who rely upon the white dust you harvest. The ocean never fails in its breath. It promises renewal every single day, returning whatever was taken, the tide pulling back only to rise again. This endless dependability is what anchors your daily existence and gives meaning to the quiet rhythm of scooping and spreading salt crystals across vast pans. Your life, rooted beside this unending blue expanse, has become calibrated to its breathing, a slow, purposeful alignment with nature's most persistent schedule. You continue walking slowly, turning slightly so that you face inland, toward the cluster of houses that contain your family and your tools. The smell of wood smoke mixes subtly with the salt air, signaling the nearing end of labor and the shift into domestic life. You feel a quiet tiredness in your limbs, not of exhaustion, but of having accomplished something structured and necessary. Your day was defined by the sea, yet its conclusion leads you safely back to solid ground, ready for rest, knowing that even when you sleep, the pull of the water and the memory of the crystalline white dust will continue to govern your dreams and your thoughts about tomorrow's dawn. The last light of day has begun to withdraw from the sky, leaving the colors muted and deep over the Mediterranean. You walk a short distance from the water's edge, turning your steps slowly until you reach the quiet path that leads back toward the cluster of dwellings. The rhythmic sound that accompanied your journey earlier, the lapping tide, the gentle shushing of waves against the shore, has softened into something more distant, muffled by the growing twilight. You feel a subtle shift in the air temperature, a coolness creeping up from the baked earth and contrasting gently with the remaining warmth on your skin. This change signals the closing of the working day, marking a transition not merely of light, but of rhythm itself. You walk slowly, noticing how the shadows lengthen and soften the sharp edges of the buildings around you. The familiar smells that have defined your morning, the intense, sharp aroma of wet salt mixed with drying earth, are giving way to the sweeter, more complex sense of a coastal evening. You catch hints of slow-burning wood smoke drifting on the breeze, mixed with the fainter, yeasty smell of baking bread, and something faintly smoky from cooking fires beginning in neighboring homes. Your pace becomes even more deliberate. The muscles in your legs feel the gentle fatigue accumulated through hours of careful, repetitive motion. You pass by bins where scraps of drying fish scales are left to weather, their bones already bleached pale by the sun. Another house smells distinctly of cedar wood and dried herbs, perhaps mint or wild rosemary gathered from the nearby scrubland. The cumulative scents tell a story of settled life. They speak of preservation and quiet routine. You feel the faint grit of fine salt dust under the soles of your sandals, a familiar layer that seems to adhere everywhere, to your clothes, to the skin on your forearms, to the wooden scoop you carry tucked at your hip. As you approach the communal area where temporary eating spaces are set up, you see others beginning their evening preparations. There is no urgency in their movements, only a measured settling into the rhythm of domestic life after sustained physical effort. Small clusters of people are gathering around low tables or simple ground mats. You move quietly through this space, not wanting to disrupt the quiet anticipation that settles over everyone at dusk. The preparation for the meal is almost ritualistic in its simplicity. There is no elaborate cooking. Instead, sustenance is derived from what was stored and preserved during the long day of labor, mirroring the cycle of the sea itself, harvesting and storing enough to sustain until the next tide brings replenishment. You observe how vessels containing flatbread are set out, their surfaces faintly dusting with flour, waiting for heat to make them palatable again. Near these, baskets hold dark, plump dates, glistening slightly in the fading light, their natural sugars catching any stray reflection. The process of preparing the meal involves a quiet communal efficiency. Hands move rhythmically, scooping cooled grains into mixing bowls, spreading out damp cloths near a low cooking fire, arranging earthenware pots. There is an understanding passing between people that requires no words, a knowing glance or a gentle straightening of a corner of a mat. You settle down onto a clean, woven mat on the periphery of this small gathering space, your physical weariness inviting a deep stillness. The air grows cooler now, carrying the damp chill that promises the high tides to come. It settles over everything, making the warmth from the communal fires feel even more precious and necessary. Your focus shifts inward. You become acutely aware of the slight ache in your shoulders, the calluses on your palms where the salt has etched itself into the skin, and the steady drumming of your own breathing against the background murmur of quiet conversation. You are offered a small portion of this evening's meal. It is simple, perhaps flatbread that has been gently reheated over embers until it yields slightly, and several dates placed within easy reach. You pick up a date, turning its curved skin in your fingers. The texture is smooth and slightly tacky, the color deep mahogany against the paler grains. As you eat, you notice how intensely sweet the fruit is, a pure burst of natural energy that counterbalances the subtle saltiness lingering on your tongue from the day's labor. The meal encourages reflection upon the fundamentals. Life here, near this crystalline bounty, relies entirely on simple, dependable cycles, the moon pulling the tides, the sun evaporating the water, and human hands meticulously gathering the resulting powder. There is a quiet philosophical satisfaction in recognizing that such immense richness, the very minerals sustaining distant trade routes, can be reduced to something so utterly basic: brine, evaporation, and patience. As you eat, you watch another worker nearby methodically crumbling a portion of dried fish onto some bread, absorbing its savory essence. The combination of salt, grain, and preserved protein is profoundly grounding. It speaks less of culinary art and more of sheer, undeniable sustenance. This meal sustains the energy not just for tomorrow's work, but perhaps for the passing evening itself. The conversation around you remains soft. Neighbors discuss the predicted behavior of the tides or recount small stories of family life, their voices pitched low to respect the encroaching night. These conversations weave together with the distant, rhythmic sighing of the sea, a constant, breathing sound that reminds you of the immense power just beyond your little cluster of dwellings. The simple act of sharing this meal strengthens more than just physical stomachs. It reinforces the invisible bonds between people who rely on each other for the rhythms of survival. You feel a deep sense of quiet belonging to this community, bound together by the relentless presence and the steady yield of salt. The pervasive scent is now a blend of cooked bread, sweet dates, salt dust, and wood smoke, the unique aroma of Phoenician home life at dusk. Once your portion is finished, you do not move quickly. Instead, you sit for a sustained period in quiet contemplation. Your hands rest in your lap, palms slightly dusty from the day's work. You look out toward the darkening horizon where the last hints of bruised purple and soft gold fade into indigo. The sea remains immense, utterly indifferent to the small human effort on the pans, yet it is precisely that relentless pattern, the predictable rise and fall, that allows your existence, and therefore your community's livelihood, to flourish. You feel the first full weight of sleep pulling at the edges of your eyelids. You draw a slow, deep breath, incorporating the clean salt scent mixed with the warmth of the recent meal into your being. The steady quiet of the evening becomes a lullaby, a gentle promise of rest before the moon begins its work again, and the cycle will begin anew with the first call of the high tide. The sun has dipped far into the western expanse, leaving behind only a wash of deep indigo across the sea. You find yourself back in your small workspace near the main drying pans, though this time the labor is quiet. The movement around you slows with the waning light, adopting the rhythm of settling exhaustion rather than purposeful action. A gentle dampness rises from the ground, carrying the residual scent of brine and dried mineral, a smell that has become indistinguishable from the air itself over countless seasons. You feel a slight ache in your lower back and the joints in your fingers, a deep thrumming ache that is simply the cost of working with such relentless cycles. You are preparing for tomorrow's work, which means preparation does not mean doing. It means noticing. Your gaze drifts across the various tools laid out. The simple wooden scoops carved from local hardwood, the tightly woven baskets of reeds, and perhaps a length of sturdy hemp rope used for securing loads. You pick up one of the scooped implements. It is smoothed by generations of handling, the wood darkened by salt spray and oil. You run your thumb along the edge, feeling its familiar grain, noticing where a hairline fracture has begun to appear near the bowl. This scoop, like every other object in this small corner of the world, tells a story of repetition, of mornings before sunrise, of scraping against crystallized crusts, of the rhythmic lift and deposit. You run your finger over the break, realizing that while the tool is worn, its purpose remains unshaken. It speaks to the deep dependability required by life here, the need for things, even small wooden scoops, to simply last. Next, you examine the baskets. They are woven from tough marsh grasses and reeds, materials that survive the salt corrosion better than wood. You kneel down slowly, testing the weave at several points. A few spots show signs of stress. A loop has stretched slightly too far, or a corner's knot has loosened its grip. These minor tears require your attention tonight. You fetch a small amount of fiber and wet earth, preparing to gently repair the weaving. The process is incredibly slow, meticulous work that demands patience entirely separate from physical strength. You press the new fibers into place, learning again how easily structure can be disrupted by time or excessive strain. As you work on the warp and weft, you find yourself mentally mapping out tomorrow's needs. How many baskets will be required to hold the gathered, medium-grade crystals? Will the tide bring in a higher concentration of crust near the western edge, demanding extra scrutiny from your neighbors at dawn? The repair work continues into quiet contemplation. You realize that mending is not just fixing something broken. It is an act of continuing purpose. Each small knot you pull tight ensures the basket can hold its weight tomorrow, ensuring that the product, the pure white dust essential for preservation and trade, can leave your community. This simple task transforms your focus from the immense scale of the sea to the manageable scale of human craft. Your attention wanders slightly, drifting back toward the drying pans visible just beyond your small patch. The tide has finally receded almost entirely now, leaving behind a wet, reflective expanse of mud mixed with fine salt residue. The moonlight catches this newly exposed surface, turning it into a vast, uneven sheet of silver glass. You observe how the patterns of the receding water left mineral traces, small crescent shapes and dried rivulets that catch and refract the cool light. It is an incredible display of slow physics. The water has been pulling back, revealing what was hidden beneath its smooth surface all day. This movement reminds you of the steady power of natural systems. They do not rush or struggle. They simply cycle. You sit down on a low stool near your workspace, allowing your legs to rest and feel the cool dampness seep through your sandals. The air is cooling now, adopting the crisp, sharp scent of minerals mixed with the deep undertow smell that speaks of vast oceanic life beyond sight. You breathe deeply, inhaling this complex aroma, salt, wet earth, decay, life, and let it settle within you. Looking outward again, your thoughts naturally turn to the continuity of time here. Life is measured not by the count of days, but by the rise and fall of the tide, by the predictable shift from low-light labor to bright midday heat, and finally, to this quiet evening cool. The cycles are reliable, demanding absolute adherence to their schedule. This reliance creates a deep, shared understanding among those who live by the sea. That mastery here is not about conquering nature, but about anticipating it. You pick up one of the heavy wooden weights used near the trade area, checking its balance and ensuring it is clean and dry for tomorrow's measurements. The weight feels solid and grounded in your hand. You remember the bustling energy of Chapter 6, the intense focus required to sort and grade the yield by visual purity. That day's accumulated wisdom settles over you, knowing that a slight variation in the crystallization means not just different profit margins, but potentially differing trade relationships with distant inland towns. The cool air carries the faintest whisper of distant voices, perhaps a neighboring family returning from the market, or simply the sound of wind playing across the flats. You listen intently to these ambient noises, letting them wash away the sharpness of the day's effort. The rhythmic shush of your breath becomes almost synchronized with the gentle lapping of water against the outer edge of the protective jetties. You finally finish securing the last few reeds in a basket, tying the knot tightly and neatly. The small ritual is complete. You smooth the dirt from your hands and wipe the faint dusting of salt crystals from your worn tunic sleeve. There is a profound sense of quiet accomplishment that settles over you, not the dramatic feeling of finishing a monumental task, but the deep peace derived from knowing that everything was done correctly for this day's cycle. As you walk back towards your dwelling, moving past the dim glow of oil lamps being lit by other families, you feel the weight not just of your body, but of accumulated experience. You have seen many dawns break over these very pans. You know how to read the signs in the mud and the light better than any seasonal prediction. The memories of the day, the cool, wet drag of the crystal underfoot, the steady shush as you spread the mints across the mat, the careful sorting by grade, are already sinking into a deep pool of rest. The salt is more than just crystals. It is compressed time and organized labor. It is the visible proof of patience. And tomorrow, when the moon's memory calls you out before dawn again, you will be ready to meet that